The cathartic teacher. What's the problem with the cathartic approach to teaching? These are some notes that I wrote the other day while contemplating not just a teaching session that I observed online, but a sort of shift I've noticed in our community over, say, I don't know, especially the last several years. And there's been a big emphasis placed on the personal narrative of the instructor, the personal narrative of the imam or whoever the speaker is. And I'm talking about people who are doing religious instruction. And my concern is that obviously storytelling and narrative, the Qur'an tells us many things in a storytelling fashion. But when it comes to the instruction of religion, like tarbiyah, what we might call, there can be an issue when everything becomes one about the personal narrative of the instructor and not putting the content front and center. I say this as somebody who teaches religion. And sometimes I feel that one of the reasons why cult of personality has become so prevalent in our community, and not only ours. It's just that, maybe perhaps it's the time that we live in, right? Is there's a little too much emphasis on the sort of identity of the person or whatever teaching, and there's not really enough emphasis placed on the content of what is being taught, right? So I just put a few notes here, doing some research on both teaching and catharsis, right? And so, of course, it might be helpful to even, stop for a moment and what is meant here by, catharsis, and something that comes from the Greek that actually means to purge the body. Some have said that it has a root in defecation or to, purge the body of impurities. And so certainly in the modern context, catharsis, which is related to the dramatic arts, and that can be that idea of, to put in common speech, right, getting something off of your chest, right? So going through something traumatic, going through something difficult, going through all of those things, and then how do you deal with that, right? And so I've seen increasingly people become kind of enthralled by this, and so I was watching somebody the other day, and they were invited to give a lecture, right, on Islam. And so when they were talking, they began to share from their personal story about how, due to the racism of the Arabs, that they almost left Islam. And of course, this isn't to make fun or light of racism, which is most certainly a repugnant thing to have to deal with. Something even myself, I have most certainly dealt with a number of times. That being said, the person was, talking about how, because of the way somebody treated or mistreated them, that would give cause for them to leave the religion. And I know this may not be fashionable today in the time of narrative and personal storytelling and, all this. But to me, what I found, really, really disconcerting was almost this kind of like, well, if that had really happened, that would have been okay. And the blame would have fallen completely upon, right, the evil racist Arabs. And, again, not to make light of people who have dealt with that, but the Quran also speaks about the need to have resilience. And I think this is something, perhaps I can speak on as a personal narrative, as it relates to a teaching moment, not just simply like pouring my heart out and going and getting a therapist. I mean, some of these people, they really sound like, man, you just need to go to therapy, man. Instead of using the majlis, using your position to just simply, pour out your heart. And so the Quran speaks to us about the need to have sabr. And of course, the very poor translation of sabr is patience versus more like perseverance. You may indeed encounter, and again, this is not trying to excuse bad behavior, but you will need to have a spirit of determination, to be quite frank, for any new Muslims that are out there, or somebody considering, becoming Islam, or even somebody who's born Muslim, but, you've had some, negative experiences within the community. One is this idea that our community is a community of perfect individuals, and that there aren't people in our community that have bad qualities, right? But also, again, the Quran, right, it encourages us and champions us to persevere despite all that. So, for instance, if you look at the passage in Surah Al-Insan, Surah Ad-Dahr, the 75th chapter, where Allah says, فَاصْبِرْ لِحُكْمِ رَبِّكَ, right? And have sabr, right? Be perseverant in the hukm, the judgment, the command of your Lord, which is what? To preach, right? He's telling the Prophet ﷺ to preach to the people, and he's not getting the most rosy reaction. So he says, فَاصْبِرْ لِحُكْمِ رَبِّكَ وَلَا تُطِعْ مِنْهُمْ آثِمًا أَوْ كَفُورًا. And right, and don't allow their vitriol, don't allow their bad manners, don't allow their sins or their mistakes to then steer you yourself into sin. And so when listening to this person discuss about how, and again, I've actually heard this person recount this several times. It's like almost like a part of their shtick. Like everywhere they go, no matter what they talk about, somehow this kind of creeps into it. And there's never this idea of like championing and persevering. I mean, obviously the person did because they're still Muslim, right? But just the way that so much in this sort of cathartic and narrative point of view, so much emphasis is placed on the negative and not on the positive. And that whether it is a racist person or a belligerent person or whatever that it is, we must not kid ourselves that we will be able to escape having our faith tested. And of course, who can say in what way, manner, or fashion that the test will come in. And so, particularly in the religious context, I feel that we should return to a focus on studying the religion for the purpose of religion, right? Studying it so that we can know how to better worship Allah and all the different aspects of worship, that we can try to direct our lives in a way that we will optimize the mercy of Allah to forgive us when we ourselves become sinful, or perhaps even have a moment of lack of etiquette or whatnot, and move away from this overemphasis. I almost feel like, I don't know, at some point there was like some kind of conference where everybody in our community read Joseph Campbell's his book on mythology. And And again, this pouring out about pain. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a place for that as Muslims. As one friend of mine said today, like, yeah, I was running some ideas with him, over this. And he's like, yeah, sometimes when we get together, we do sometimes vent, right? We'll vent about this thing or that thing. And, we need, places and spaces for that. I just don't believe that that should be the majlis, right? The teaching chair. I do not believe that that is the place for that. Because then, one, the audience can become easily kind of distracted and caught up in your narrative, in your trauma, in your pain, and it can induce people to have a sense of empathy, right? Where we almost, this kind of pathos, right? And even in areas in which it doesn't even apply to themselves, right? So it can kind of be very suggestive in nature. And then the next thing you know, this is what everybody's kind of focusing on, right? So I had looked at, for instance, there was an article written by a person that works actually in marketing, right? But they wrote in this magazine called Stir Magazine back in 2018 in an article that was called "The Problem with Storytelling." The author's name is Daniel Stanley, and he said, any organization that sees itself as having a social or ethical cause is told that the key to their success is effective storytelling, though often with little definition of what exactly that means in practice, right? And so I know that we want to make all of this, very relevant content, as if the Qur'an is not relevant, as if the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ isn't relevant, as if 1400 years of traditional scholarship isn't relevant. Right? When we want to take a certain amount of creative license with that and then start talking about, narrative and storytelling, as Stanley says, right? He's like, there's little definition of what exactly, right, that means. And in the idea of, this kind of catharsis, right? This getting it off of our chest, bearing ourselves, right? Instead of in the therapy chair or with a friend, right? We're doing it while we're teaching, right? There's an interesting article by Richard Kearney from 2017, published in Paragraph, the journal called Paragraph. And he has a piece that he wrote called Narrative Pain, the Power of Catharsis. And he said, but left to itself, pathos, right? This kind of empathizing, right? And, especially with pity, right? He said, but left to itself, pathos risked becoming bathos, which means like getting lost. You kind of like, you get lost in the sauce of what the empathy is supposed to build towards, and it becomes somewhat anticlimactic, right? So he said it becomes the risk of becoming bathos or bathos. He said there was always the danger of a pathology of pity, a sentiment or histrionic extreme where the spectator loses his or her wits and becomes blinded by excessive passion. That latter part there, right, becoming blinded by excessive passion. I feel that, if you're going to teach Islam as an imam, as a ustad, as a sheikha, whatever, right, the Quran is quite clear in its judgment upon excessive passions and people, right? Like people they in some ways, right? Some people don't follow anything but their passions, their hawa. And so, certainly wanting, there is a creative art to teaching, right? To have some charisma. I mean, even myself, I employ from time to time a little bit of humor, even what I do, as a device to wake people up. Right, especially when you're teaching for an hour or two, and you want to make sure that everybody's awake and kind of snap out of because it can sometimes be a lot of information overload. I can use that as a device from time to time just to make sure that people are snapping back to attention. But to where everything is about it becomes excessive about passion. Now, being passionate about the topic itself, that's fine. I get quite passionate about, many different topics of Islam and teaching it, right? But that's separate or somewhat different or quite different, from just simply using your passions as a result of certain experiences, traumatic, difficult, painful, right? And using that as a means, a vehicle, and a platform to to teach from. I feel that just we should be somewhat cautious about that. Have a little bit more reverence for the material that we are, hopefully trying to teach and discuss. And I say this too, like as anybody out there teaching, but also just for the casual learner, try to learn from people who are serious. Somebody who does a YouTube live set and they spend 60, 70, 80% of the time laughing and giggling. I don't think this is the kind of person that you probably want to entrust your hereafter to. So take your Islam seriously. If you happen to be a person that is teaching, rethink, I'm not saying everybody is doing this, but for those who are, rethink this whole personal story as a means of teaching Islam, because what you're really doing is just teaching people about how you feel, right? And that ain't the same as revelation. So anyway, just some notes I had wanted to share. I had done a little bit of research on it. The last note, particularly, I had here on catharsis, just to share, wrapping up, right, to help also give what I mean by catharsis, right? Kearney, he wrote, catharsis, that singular experience of release, right? Equanimity and calm, which issues from the mutual encounter and surpassing of pity by fear and of fear by pity, right? But especially that, right? It's it's about your experiences. And I'm not saying there might not be a time and a place for that kind of thing, but, to the point where, we wonder why our community, is sometimes so enthralled by cult of personality. It's because I think some of the people who are teaching are indulging that temptation to catharsis and narrative, personal narrative, just a little bit too much, and that we should obviously try to de-emphasize ourselves when talking about the Book of Allah and, of course, His Messenger, alayhi salawat wassalam. So anyway, just a few thoughts I wanted to share on that. والصلوات الله تعالى على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.